Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad that you have joined us back today after our last workshop a couple of weeks ago. Today, our topic is unraveling bias in the brain. And this is one of my favorite things to teach, so I'm excited to talk to you about that. Although I think I said that last time too. I do love teaching. So my name is Megan Pollock. I am an engineer turned educator. And so my work now really focuses on engineering equity into education and the workforce. And my personal mission is to provide services, tools, resources that inspire awareness and initiate action. And I do this because I envision a world where personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving potential, and where kindness, inclusivity, and conservation prevail. So this is part of a series. About a month ago, we met and we talked about feedback. Today, we're talking about bias and how that works in our brain. And March 18th. So that one's gonna be a little bit different. It's going to be not on a Monday. So you'll want to pay attention to that. And then on April 12th, we'll be back on a Monday and it will be self-awareness for social justice. I'm excited again that you chose to be here with us today. And what we're talking about today is, I think, really fascinating. And it really anchors in this one truth. One is that everyone has a brain and everyone has bias. These are facts. And the purpose of the webinar of this workshop is not to prove those facts necessarily. The point of this workshop is to talk about how all of these things that, we're going to be talking about discrimination, prejudice, bias, how they function in our brain. So hopefully I don't need to prove to you that we all have brains. We all just accept that we do have those brains. And so the purpose of this workshop is to help us unravel the way that bias is happening in our brain. And we're doing this because if we use our brains to understand and combat bias, we can create a more inclusive and just world. So we have 4 objectives for our session today. First, we're going to discuss some of the barriers to an inclusive and just world. While doing that, we're gonna outline key terms to add to or to reinforce our vocabulary. We're gonna look at 8 neural mechanisms in our brain that support prejudice and stereotypes, which are the underlying functions of bias. Now, my goal is not that you leave this workshop with some, that you're ready to go do brain surgery. That's not the point. The point isn't that you actually remember what the names of these neural mechanisms are. The point is that we begin to recognize that there are systems in our brain that are supporting the way that prejudice and stereotypes function, and how that becomes the bias that each and all of us hold. Throughout the workshop, I'm going to identify 9 self-regulation strategies that will help us reduce prejudice and stereotypes. So to help us get started, I want you to go ahead and access that file. And so in our small groups, we're gonna go into small groups here shortly. I want us to think about, what does an inclusive and just world look like? And what are the barriers to an inclusive and just world? So before we start brainstorming this, I want you to look at the PDF that I have shared with you. So let's see, where's that? So if you open up the PDF, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour guide here. So when you open up the file, the first section here are all the key terms. The second, or page 3, are the strategies. So again, you have the notes here that I'm going to be giving you. This is the activity sheet that we're going to be working on. You'll notice on the sheet, if you are using this within your Adobe or whatever PDF tool that you read, these little links, these are hyperlinks. So this one here will go back to your key terms. The second one here goes to your strategies, and then this one goes to the notes page, which is the next page. So we're going to start here on activity 1. You can fill it in however you need right there. And then as we go through the 8 neural mechanisms in our brain, you'll be able to take notes here on this sheet. We'll have some activities that we're going to be doing throughout there, and there are hyperlinks here. So when we talk about the amygdala first, for example, you can click here to jump to activity 2, and we'll do this activity together. Again, you can quickly use a little pencil here and that goes back to your links. So again, if you're using this on your computer, I tried to make navigation as easy as possible. And so again, make sure that you get that downloaded for our conversation now. So what we're going to be talking about first is this. I want us to think about, what does an inclusive and just world look like? And what are the barriers to an inclusive and just world? So to start with, I'd like to have you all just independently reflect on your answers to these two questions. And then we'll have some people report out. And then I'll give you some of the things that I think are the answer. All right, welcome back, everyone. So you can unmute your mic and share. What were some of the things that you talked about on what does an inclusive and just world look like to you?
I'll speak for my group. I didn't take notes though, but some of the things that we talked about was being respectful, and making sure that people within your work, everybody in the world has a voice and is heard, and overall kindness.
Great, I love those. Respect, kindness, people are heard. Thank you. What is your name? I just see B. Rutherford. What
It's Bionica.
Bionica, great. Thanks, Bionica. What else?
I talked about in our group that people are respected for who they are and what they bring to the table.
Yeah, so a trend here of respect and the value of what people bring. Thanks, Monica. Anything else that came up? Yannicka added that everyone has a voice. Great. So what does a more inclusive and just world look like to me? So to me, it is a world where personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving potential. It's a world where differences are honored and not feared. It is a world where true equality is a given. It is an assumption here, but it is not necessarily true. And it's a world where kindness, acceptance, and love prevail. And so I think that that certainly aligns with what you all discussed. So the second question here is, what are the barriers to an inclusive and just world? Because when we think about the four reasons I just gave, you know, they may seem very idealistic, and perhaps it is, because we certainly aren't there yet. But what keeps us from achieving that are certainly barriers. And so what were some of the things that came up for you in your conversations?
I said people are barriers.
Okay, in what ways?
Because, I mean, a lot of times we can't see past ourselves, you know?
Yeah. That's a great connection to what we're talking about today, because we're talking about the ways in which prejudice and stereotypes exist in our brains, and that we may be barriers to other people, both in how we interpersonally act with them, but in the way that we create and reinforce the systems in which we work and serve and function unintentionally. And so we can both be the barrier, and we can create the barriers that affect other people. What else?
I would agree with that. And one of the things to kind of add on to that is, if we put a lot of emphasis on some of the things that we said, like love and kindness, right now, especially in today's world, people have their own code for what those two things look like. And we can't force love. I can't force my coworker to love me. I can put some policies and things in place to where she has to respect me, or he has to respect me, or include me in on, you know, projects and collaborate with me. But, you know, creating that environment oftentimes can't really rely too heavily on emotional feelings, because we're all very different, and, you know, that's very fluid.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think when I use the word love, I don't mean it in probably some of the nuanced ways that people think of it. I think I use it in like the opposite of hate, right? Like that it's a function of like there that isn't the primary sort of driver in us. And I appreciate your input that that is a word that can sometimes have a connotation that's uncomfortable for some. And it's certainly not something that we can always measure. Yeah. Thanks, Bianca. What else?
This is Holly, and this kind of dovetails off of what Monica mentioned in looking at, what an inclusive and just world looks like. But a barrier is our egos. In terms of believing, only having our own experience, and formulating our own opinions, it's hard to get beyond that.
Yeah.
But also, in a world where people are striving for success, sometimes the ego can also play a part in terms of, really wanting to alienate others so that, someone can move ahead,
Yeah. Thank you so much, Holly. So the sort of concepts of ego and success and how that can certainly get in the way to a more inclusive and just world. Thank you. Anything else that comes to mind? We'll certainly keep listing things as you come up with them to sort of frame our conversation and how I'm going to describe some barriers within this conversation. Now, this certainly isn't a complex overview of all barriers to an inclusive and just world, but how I'm going to frame this are through some definitions that help us really examine barriers. And these definitions will be important for our conversation on the brain. All right. So first we have prejudice. And so again, you have this in your handout, all the key terms. So you're welcome to take notes, but they will definitely be in your handouts. So prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. And so within the field of social psychology, prejudice refers more specifically to attitudes and emotional responses towards a group and its members. Discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people. People can be discriminated by race, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, ability, and age, just to name a few. And so again, I'm framing some of the barriers based on these definitions, and we're going to talk more about these when we start digging in and understanding how these neural mechanisms in our brain support these different barriers. So the next definition is oppression. So oppression is the combination of prejudice and power, which creates systems that discriminate against some groups and benefits others. So again, it's a system that discriminates against some groups and benefits other groups. So examples of these systems are the isms: racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. These are kinds of things that are these systems of oppression. And there are 4 types of oppression: ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And these systems, they overlap and they interact. And so systems of oppression, they enable dominant groups to exert control over non-dominant groups by limiting their rights, their freedoms, and their access to basic resources such as healthcare, education, employment, housing. And so the 4 I's of systemic oppression, we'll actually cover this. I think we're going to cover this in another one of our workshops. But the key takeaway is that these systems are designed by people and they are upheld by people. In many cases, if you are from the dominant group, you may not even recognize that you are contributing to upholding these systems. And so that's part of this work and of increasing our own awareness, is the sort of self-regulation that goes in part with that, to begin recognizing the ways that we are complicit in these systems of oppression. So next are stereotypes. So stereotypes are widely held but fixed, oversimplified, and generalized images or ideas of a particular type of person or thing, including personal traits or circumstantial attributes. And so stereotypes can become ideological beliefs held within one's culture that lead to assumptions about characteristics, behaviors, and social norms. So again, if you want to access these definitions, they are in your handout. And so the next is marginalization, another barrier to an inclusive and just world. So marginalization is the treatment of a person, a group, or a concept as insignificant or peripheral. So it's literally like on the edges. So marginalized groups refer to individuals who are consistently confined to the lower or peripheral edges, the margins of society or groups, because they are commonly seen as different from the perceived norms and dominant cultures. Marginalized individuals often experience disadvantage and discrimination that stem from systemic social inequalities and injustices. A next barrier, and this is something if you've participated in any of our workshops that I've done with you all before, are micromessages. So micromessages, these are the sort of interpersonal level, right? So we talked about the 4 I's of oppression. Interpersonal is like, what am I doing to you? It's what's happening between you and your students, you and your colleagues. These micromessages can be sent through media. Micromessages can be sent through our curriculum, our textbook. And so micromessages are small, subtle, unconscious messages that are sent and received when communicating with others. And again, they're unconscious messages. Like if you were consciously sending messages that are oppressing and marginalizing others, like those aren't micromessages, those are macro biased messages. And so micromessages can be either positive or negative, and they communicate value to an individual. And so sometimes you might hear the word microaggression. So microaggression, if I were to create a Venn diagram of this, all microaggressions aren't micro messages, because sometimes microaggressions are intentional. And so again, what we're talking about here, micro messages, these are the unconscious messages when we are, our brain is drawing on deeply rooted cultural stereotypes, drawing on deeply rooted prejudices that, again, we're going to understand how these happen in our brain. And when we communicate those, they can send value that may actually not reflect our own personal beliefs. But because of the way that these things are embedded in our brain, if we don't increase our awareness of them and use self-regulation to modify them, then they can manifest in ways that signal bias. And so micromessages, these are relayed not only through words, but also nonverbal communication. So it's like not just what you say, it's how you say it. Micromessages are also sent by what is not said. So when we don't teach something, when we don't say something, it's what we call a hidden curriculum. And that hidden curriculum sends its own message of value about what's important. It's also, micromessages can be like what is presented or not presented, right? So as an example, this month is Black History Month. This is an intentional effort to highlight the experiences of Black Americans and their contributions to our country, and certainly the history related to them. It's not because that history isn't incredibly important every month of the year, but this is one way of having a sort of macro intentional message that these stories are important, and so we are highlighting it this month. In the same way that we have Hispanic Awareness a month and Indigenous people, times to focus on these things. They're always important, but these stories have historically not been told. And so we now have these intentional efforts to share these stories. The next barrier is implicit bias or prejudice. So implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect one's understanding. They affect our actions and they affect our decisions in an unconscious manner. So implicit prejudice is in favor of or against one thing, a person, or a group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered unfair. So these two are often unrecognized. And again, as I said with micromessaging, they may not align to one's declared beliefs and values. So the takeaway from these definitions and really thinking about some of the barriers is that prejudices, stereotypes, and consequently bias often operate in combination to influence our behavior. So again, these three things, prejudice, stereotypes, and bias, they're operating in combination to influence our behavior. So our challenge is if we can unravel these in our brain. And so I use the sort of yarn symbolism to think about how do we understand what's happening in our brain. If we can do that, we can increase our understanding of how they happen, and we can begin to shift our behavior and better contribute to a more inclusive and just world. So in our brains, the function of neurons constantly fluctuates as we engage in different activities. So from simple tasks like grabbing a cup of coffee to complex tasks like understanding systemic oppression or neuroscience, right? So the functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI, it's a technique for measuring and mapping brain activity. And so the invention of this technique in the 90s has allowed us to have a deeper understanding of the brain. And so neuroscience, in the field of neuroscience, is really fascinating because it's growing so quickly. Just in the last couple of decades, we have an increased understanding of how people learn and how it's tied to the brain. We have increased understanding again of like how different behaviors are changed. And so we're going to be talking about some of those mechanisms that have been learned through the fMRI machine today. And so research over the last 3 decades using that fMRI tells us that networks in the brain support the following: the learning, experience, and expression of prejudice, and the storage, activation, and behavioral expression of social stereotypes. So again, when I started the workshop out, I made the point to say, like, I'm not here to prove that you have a brain. Like, you should know that, right? And so if you have a brain, this is happening. This is happening in our brain. This is what we're going to be talking about today and the way that it manifests in our brain. So again, there are networks in the brain that support our learning, experience, and expression of prejudice, as well as the storage, activation, and behavioral expression of stereotypes. We also know that networks in the brain support the self-regulation of cognitive control, which can reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. So that's sort of the good news, bad news, right? Like the bad news is that we have a brain that does these things, but the good news is that our brain supports self-regulation, cognitive control, which can help us reduce our expression of prejudice and stereotypes. And so my goal is to inspire awareness and initiate action. And so this is the action piece, is how do we begin to increase our awareness and take that intentional step of self-regulation to begin to reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. So just to check in the definition here. So self-regulation is the ability to manage one's behaviors, including the ability to set specific goals, to use appropriate strategies to attain those goals, or it's the process of acting in an intentional manner, often through mechanisms of cognitive control. So self-regulation answers 2 kinds of questions. What am I trying to achieve? Or what do I need to do it? What am I trying to achieve and what do I need to do it? And throughout this workshop, I'm going to provide you with some strategies to help you contribute to a more inclusive and just world by using self-regulation and understanding the way these mechanisms function in the brain. So again, you've already got the summary of the strategies, but we're going to go through the session and learn how they map to the neural mechanisms in the brain, and again, understand more of what we can do to make a difference. So as a reference, the strategies will be identified by slides with this image. So it'll have the red stripe on the right with the brain with a little check mark in it. And so that will kind of be your cue. So first up is we want to understand our brain. I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the work from this around the neural mechanisms comes from a white paper called The Neuroscience of Prejudice and Stereotyping by David Amadeo. And so it provides the images and the framework for the neural mechanisms of social cognition that underline the forms of bias that you'll be introduced to today. And if you're interested in reading this, I'd be happy to share a copy with you after as well. So again, what the paper does is it introduces the networks, and then I've overlaid the strategies and the narratives. Okay, so the first piece of the brain, so I'll give you the introduction to this, and we'll take our promised 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do an exercise on this. So the first is the amygdala. So the amygdala, and so you can see here on the screen, it's pointed to the little green arrows, the little green sections there. So the amygdala responds to motivationally relevant cues, whether they're aversive or rewarding, that guide adaptive behaviors. So this includes social motivations, such as the desire to affiliate or to compete with others, which is one of the most powerful of human drives. So again, social motivation is one of the most powerful of human drives, and that includes our desire to belong, our desire to affiliate, or our desire to compete with others. And so this type of motivation leads to a discernment of us from them. And this computation, this mental computation, it takes just a fraction of a second, yet it sets the stage for social categorization, stereotypes, prejudices, intergroup conflict and inequality, and at the extremes, very extremes, war and genocide. So again, it's that us versus them discernment. So given this, studies directly implicate fear conditioning as a mechanism underlying implicit prejudice. So this is because there are patterns of amygdala function with respect to intergroup responses. So intergroup means like people. One pattern reflects a learned threat response to racial outgroups, which is rooted in fear conditioning. So fear conditioning, again, another definition here, refers to the pairing of an initially neutral stimulus, such as a light or a tone, with an aversive fear eliciting stimulus. So the conditioned fear response is described in terms of emotional, behavior, or physiological, so like how your body's reacting responses. So the most famous example of human fear conditioning is the case of little Albert, an 11-month-old infant used in John Watson and Rosalie Rayner's 1920 study. You can't do this anymore, but they did some wild things back then. So like most babies, Albert had a natural fear of extremely loud noises, but no aversion to white rats. So Watson and Rayner presented him with a white rat, but when he reached to touch it, they struck a hammer against a steel bar just behind his head. So they're taking a natural fear of like startling, extreme loud noises, and they're combining it with his interaction with this white rat, to which he had no aversion, no fear conditioning before this moment. So after 7 repetitions of seeing the rat and hearing the frightening noise, Albert burst into tears at the mere sight of the rat. So the rat began to become correlated with this loud noise. I'm afraid of the loud noise, and the rat is associated with the loud noise. Therefore, I'm afraid of both. So in addition, Albert showed some generalization of his learned fear response. He would cry at the sight of objects that resembled a white rat, such as a white dog or a white coat. And so fear conditioning, it can be acquired in a single trial, and it can be expressed primarily through behavioral freezing, anxiety, or heightened vigilance. Now, you may have heard of Pavlov's dogs. So that's an experiment conducted by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, wherein he used his dogs. His dogs started to salivate when he rang a bell. The dog started to salivate. This is the best known example of classical conditioning, when a neural stimulus is paired with a conditioned response. And so again, the research, I'm not saying we are dogs, I'm saying that conditioned fear responses have been found across multiple species and include various responses, such as changes in autonomic activity, that's your heart, your blood pressure, your skin conductance, so like, like you get sort of, your hairs stand up. Defensive behavior, so like you're freezing. Maybe it could be your fight or flight mode. Your endocrine response, so that's your hormone release. It could be pain sensitivity and modulation of reflex expressions like fear, potentiated startle, and eye blink response, right? So all of these are ways, these autonomic activity that you could respond to a different kind of fear conditioned responses. So social prejudices are scaffolded by basic level neurocognitive structures, but their expression is guided by personal goals and normative expectations. So again, social prejudices are scaffolded by basic level neurocognitive structures, but their expression is guided by personal goals and normative expectations. And so what we're going to do when we come back from our first break is we're going to examine our fear conditioning. We're going to think about what irrational fear conditioning could we identify in our life. One of the most common racially motivated and irrational fear conditioning is of Black men in hoodies being dangerous. Just because a Black man wears a hoodie does not mean he's dangerous, but somehow we have developed a fear conditioning against this imagery, and that this is very dangerous. I want to read right before we go to break a brief excerpt from Whistling Vivaldi. It's by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, and the excerpt is about New York Times columnist Brent Staples. So the book here says, consider the experience of Brent Staples, now a columnist for the New York Times, but then a psychology graduate student at the University of Chicago, a young African-American male dressed in informal clothing walking down the streets of Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood. In his own words, he writes, I became an expert in the language of fear. Couples locked arms or reached for each other's hands when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. People who were carrying on conversations went mute and stared straight ahead as though avoiding my eyes would save them. I'd been a fool. I'd been walking the streets, grinning good evening at people who were frightened to death of me. I did violence to them by just being. How had I missed this? I tried to be innocuous, but didn't know how. I began to avoid people. I turned out of my way into side streets to spare them the sense that they were being stalked. Out of nervousness, I began to whistle and discovered I was good at it. My whistle was pure and sweet and also in tune. On the street at night, I whistled popular tunes from the Beatles and Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The tension drained from people's bodies when they heard me. A few even smiled as they passed me in the dark. And so what he was dealing with was a very bad stereotype about his race that is common in many communities and likely across the country. And it's the stereotype that young African-American males in neighborhoods that are perceived where they don't belong are prone to violence. And this is completely false. It is a terrible stereotype, and it was affecting this young man. And so I promised a break. So we're going to go to break and we're going to debrief this, and then we're going to do an exercise on examining our fear conditioning. So again, we're going to do a 10-minute break. And so what we're going to do first is independently reflect on the following questions. What is an irrational fear conditioning that you can identify in your life? What is your emotional, behavioral, or physiological response to the stimulus? And how can you use self-regulation to modify this fear conditioning? To sort of simplify these questions, I've created a little formula. When I see X, it's a stimulus that's generally a stereotype. I feel or do Y. I know this is fear conditioning, so I can change my response by doing Z. Now, to get you warmed up, you might choose, like, when I see spiders, I feel or do, I'm scared and I jumped. I know this is fear conditioning, so I can change my response by reminding myself that the spider, takes care of mosquitoes. That's a helpful exercise to help you understand fear conditioning in your life. But what I really want you to focus on are more kinds of fear conditioning related to people who are different than you, or maybe people to which you recognize you might have a stereotype. And so maybe if you hold a fear conditioned fear about men in hoodies and who are walking fast, or whatever the scenario is, think about how you feel and what you can do, what sort of self-regulation you can do to modify your response. All right. So again, access this worksheet. You can fill in the blank here. So we're going to do this independently, and then I'm going to put us back in breakout groups to give you a chance to debrief it with some of our other participants. All right, welcome back, everyone. I popped into both rooms. It looked like you were having some good conversation. What I'd like to do is to have you pop in the chat one of your formulas. When I see X, I feel or do Y. I know this is fear conditioning, perhaps Y. So I can change my response by doing Z. So type out one of your reflections and drop it in the chat. When I see X, I feel or do Y. I know that this is fear conditioning because, so I can change my response by doing Z. So I think both rooms were talking about homeless, people experiencing homelessness. And so a few years ago, I recognized that when I see people experiencing homelessness, I feel or do the following. I avoid them, I don't look at them, and I just generally kind of ignore them. I know that this is fear conditioning because of just the media, perhaps my upbringing, like it's a fear conditioning. And so I made a choice to change my response by looking at people. If they spoke to me, I would acknowledge that they spoke to me. And if I needed to keep moving, I would keep moving. But I wanted to treat them like humans. And I wanted to give them that respect. And so that's an example how I recognized that I had a general stereotype and a stimulus. I recognized how I feel, and I adjusted my fear conditioning. I also noticed that in my travels that I would, when I was walking through cities, because before COVID, I used to travel weekly. It's hard to imagine that anymore. But,
I didn't get that.
and I noticed that when I would travel and I'd be in the city, like you're walking through, main city streets, I noticed that I would grab my handbag tighter in certain circumstances when I would see people who I thought, might take my bag. And so what I did here is I noticed when I see people who look like they're likely to rob me, I feel or do what? I feel anxious. I tighten my grip on my bag. I know this is fear conditioning because, I've seen the movies, but I can change my response by certainly, I'm not saying like take your guard down. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying like not everyone that you cross on the street is going to rob you. This happened to me a couple of years ago. I was in Hawaii on a work trip, and I had extended my trip, and I stayed in like an Airbnb. The first and last time, I think I might stay in an Airbnb, but there was no parking near where I was staying, so I had to like schlep my stuff really long way. And so I guess I was going to the beach one day, and I guess I looked like a bag lady, because I had all these giant bags, not to mention that they were very expensive bags. And I was walking to my like convertible rental car. But as I walked by this guy in his van, he locked his doors. Like I could tell he had locked his doors, and he like sort of tensed up like I was a homeless person. Maybe I should reflect on how I dress on beach days. But I was like, wow, like I knew I wasn't a threat, but I thought, wow, this is what other people feel like when we have these immediate responses of locking the doors when someone walks up. Like, and it didn't feel good, right? Again, I knew I was no threat. And so having experienced that, it made me really pay attention to, am I having these reactions because they are based on something logical that I am not necessarily judging this person, and how is that making them feel? Am I dehumanizing them, right? So these are some examples. So hopefully you were able to come up with some different examples. And this is a reflective practice, right? Like you go through life and you begin to recognize when you react some way. Ask yourself, is this a fear conditioning response? What is it based on? Am I treating this person in the way that they deserve to be treated, or am I making assumptions about them in this scenario? I see, I don't want to, somebody direct message me about something And so I see your message, and I do think that there is certain fear conditioning when we see symbols, right? When we see people who wear symbols that might challenge our worldview, that might challenge or might be a symbol that's oppressive to us and our identity, then we can make assumptions about people based on that, and they may be warranted sometimes, and they may not be in others. All right, thank you for participating in that exercise. We're going to move to the next neural network in the brain, and we're going to learn about the insula. So this is part of the prejudice network in our brain. And so the insula, it's frequently associated with responses to racial outgroup versus in-group members and in different experimental tasks. So the findings from these studies are interpreted as reflecting a negative visceral reaction, such as disgust, to racial outgroups. And it has been specifically associated with white subjects' implicit negative attitudes towards Black people. So what this means is the insula seems to contribute to the emotional affect that is often experienced as part of a prejudiced response. And so, as I sort of noted in the last conversation, these sort of reactions, these visceral reactions, can be micro-messages. And the story that I read to you about Brent Staples and Whistling Vivaldi, think about here what he was experiencing. He said, couples locked arms or reached for the other's hands when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. Like, these are physical responses, right? Like, they're visceral reactions, and they're moving across the street. So he said people who were carrying on conversations went mute. These are all micro messages that sometimes people may unconsciously be doing, but they're sending a really powerful signal. Think about, say that you were a little girl walking down the street with your parent in this scenario, and that your parent came across Brent Staples and they had a fear conditioned response, but their insula, part of the prejudice network, responded, and your parent grabbed, you're the little girl or little boy, your parent grabbed you really tightly and moved across the street. They didn't say anything to you. They didn't say that is a bad person. They didn't do any of that, but it's that subtle micro message that triggers a piece of data in your brain as a young child that said, this message equals this, right? It's a little baby Albert, right? When he heard a loud noise, when he saw the mouse, it meant he was afraid. So when your parent grabbed you and crossed the street and you saw a Black man in a hoodie, that became that fear conditioned response. And it's not warranted, right? Like, he's an award-winning journalist. It had nothing to do with his skin color or what he was wearing. But that's how those fear conditioned responses happen, and they're manifested through these reactions, and they are deeply tied amongst racial outgroups. So the insula is also implicated in pro-social emotions, such as empathy towards liked individuals. So empathy, another definition here, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. For example, insula activity was found to increase when subjects viewed another person being exposed to a painful stimulus, but only if that person was of the same racial group. Similarly, another study observed insula activities when members of liked but not disliked outgroups were harmed. Both findings suggest that empathy-related activity in the insula depends on the victim's social affiliation. So according to Dr. Brené Brown, empathy is a skill. According to Dr. Brené Brown, empathy is a skill that can bring people together and make people feel included, which is very different than sympathy. Sympathy creates an uneven power dynamic and can lead to more isolation and disconnection. So from one of her talks, Dr. Brené Brown described the difference between empathy and sympathy, and then it was made into a really cute little video. It's a couple minutes long. We're going to watch this video. send me a message in the chat if for some reason the audio doesn't go through. All right, here we go.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
What are some of your responses to the little video and description of the difference between empathy and sympathy by Dr. Brené Brown? What are some of your reflections? Can you think of a time when you're talking with someone and they did well, at least the silver lining it, as she called it? How did that feel? How did that feel? Joy says it felt dismissive. Yeah. How else? What else do you feel? Do you feel heard when someone says that? I'm guessing no. Do you feel cared for? Generally no, right? When someone says, well, at least this happens, it does feel very dismissive. You don't feel connection with that person. You're trying to be very vulnerable, and they are trying to make it better for you. I think this was something that came up for me a lot last year, as 2020 was tormenting so many of us, and so many of us are still being tormented by it. But as I was trying to talk to some of my friends about what I was feeling as a person in my position and my environment and how my work was affected, and people kept silver lining it, and I just kept telling them it felt like toxic positivity to me. There was no empathy in it. It was the well at least of everything's going to be great kind of thing, and that doesn't drive connection. It drives us apart. It's like a giant wedge that separates us. So kind of pulling this back together, it can be really easy to jump to conclusions about people. And because of how implicit bias works, we're prone to assign stereotypes negatively or at least untruthfully attributing some causality of events, but most of the time we don't know the whole story. One of my favorite tools from a mentor of mine is the 5 words here, and it's the question, what else might be true? So I credit my mentor Tegwin Pulley for saying this, but she can't remember where she heard it. And so sometimes when we find ourselves jumping to an immediate conclusion about someone of like that whole person experiencing homelessness is enter any kind of explanation. They are these things. Or that person wearing the hoodie walking quickly through my neighborhood is, right? To simply stop and ask what else might be true. And I count the words because it helps remind me of like, what are 5 other reasons that this might be happening, so that I don't anchor in on the one thing that's my first response. This person might live here. This person might, be visiting a friend. This person, you come up with all these different reasons. And when you do that, it dispels your singular focus, your singular assumption, and it helps you to think, potentially drive some connection with this person. And you may not be interacting with them, but always ask what else might be true here. And that can help you find some connection, at minimum, not hone in on the prejudice and stereotypes that might be triggered in your brain. So what I want us to do is to, again, access your worksheets. There is an exercise on empathy that I want us to do. So this activity, we're going to just do an independent reflection. I don't think we're going to go to groups on this because I want us to push forward with the content. But what in the worksheet, I want you to describe some areas in your life where you can practice empathy. Think about how will you practice empathy to drive connection with people who are not like you? And how can you use the phrase, what else might be true, to help you increase empathy for others? So again, you're going to find this in your packet. It's activity 3. And there are 3 fields there for you to reflect. So I'm going to give you about 3 to 4 minutes to reflect independently, and then we're going to come back together and move on to the next component in the brain. All right. So about 3 minutes of reflection on activity 3 in your packet. All right, we're going to continue on with our exploration of different parts of the brain. Next up is the striatum. So the striatum is, again, part of the prejudice network. And the striatum is broadly involved in instrumental learning and reward processes, including the coordination of goal-directed and habit-based responses. If you attended our workshop last month, we actually talked a little bit about this same part of the brain. We weren't talking about prejudice, we were talking about learning and motivation, but again, this is the same part of the brain there. So finding from functional neuroimaging research suggests that this portion of the brain is associated with the value placed on a potential action and its anticipated outcomes. The next part of the brain that we're going to look at is the orbital frontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So again, this is part of the prejudice network. So the orbital frontal cortex is often associated with the processing of our feelings, our learned associations between a certain behavior and a specific consequence, evaluation, and decision-making. So in the social domain, the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, supports the monitoring of social cues and subsequent adjustment of one's behavior. So again, in the social domain, this part of our brain is monitoring social cues and how we adjust our behavior. So this function is crucial to intergroup situations involving social norms, in which responses may be influenced by others' expectations. So you can think of a time when you're in a group and you're sort of learning and noticing what are the social norms, and then you adjust your behavior and responses to sort of fit that mold of what those norms might be. The next piece that we're looking at is the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is really focused on the empathy and mentalizing. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here. So the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in both the prejudice, stereotyping, and self-regulating networks. So again, we're talking about 3 networks here. The medial frontal cortex is an important structure for the processing of social information. So again, it's similar to what we just talked about, but it's how we're processing different bits of information. So in the context of social cognition, the medial prefrontal cortex activity has been primarily associated with the formation of impressions about other people, especially impressions that require mentalizing. So we need to define this term mentalizing. So mentalizing is the process of considering a person's unique perspective and motives. According to Chris and Uta Frith, mentalizing is the process by which we make inferences about mental states. Much of the time, these inferences are made automatically without any thought or deliberation. It is important for us to be able to read the minds of others because it is their mental states that determine their actions. So this process has been interpreted as reflecting a humanization process, and by extension, empathy. So a lack of medial prefrontal cortex activity in response to a social target may indicate a form of prejudice that is characterized by dehumanization and a lack of empathy. So dehumanization is something that I was mentioning in our last conversation. And so dehumanization is the process of depriving a person or group of positive human qualities. And sometimes it's the literal stripping of human attributes with an animal or object association. So examples, horrific examples of dehumanization include during the Holocaust, Nazis referred to Jews as rats. That's the literal stripping of human attributes and calling them animals. Natives indigenous people were dehumanized as savages who stood in the way of westward expansion. White supremacists referred to Black people as apes. Black people were kidnapped, transported, and enslaved. They were dehumanized and treated as objects that could be owned and traded. Women abducted into the sex trade are treated as objects or property and disposable. Immigrants are termed and treated as vermin, animals, or infestation. Like, these are really grotesque examples, but they are examples of dehumanization that are far too common. So dehumanization is viewed as a central component to intergroup violence, because it is frequently the most important precursor to moral exclusion, which is the process by which stigmatized groups are placed outside the boundary in which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. So dehumanization starts with language. Words matter. People are not property. People are not animals. We must consider how stereotypes, prejudice, and bias affect how we see and engage with others. I encourage you to examine the ways in which you perhaps unintentionally stop seeing groups of humans as humans. Ask yourself what else might be true. And I'm guilty of this too, and this is my life's work, right? But the key here is, how are we using self-regulation? How are we using self-awareness, driving our self-regulation, that cognitive control of the ways in which we do this? If I catch myself maybe repeating what someone else said that dehumanizes another person, someone that's on an outgroup for me, I try to stop and say, like, I don't want to say these words because they are treating someone as something less than human. Even if I don't like that person, if I don't agree with what they're doing, like people who do some of the dehumanizing things before, just because someone dehumanizes others doesn't mean I should dehumanize them. And I make a choice to recognize my language and to choose my words in a way that I can have discourse with people and dialogue with people that still keeps them in a space where they are not dehumanized, right? So the next piece of this, and we're going to spend some time in our coming workshops thinking about our lens. So if mentalizing is the process of considering a person's unique perspective and motives, what we want to begin to reflect on or continue reflecting is how does our lens, like think of it, it's an example, right? But like your literal lens, the way that you look at the world, how does it affect your assessment of others? Our lens can be clouded by a narrow worldview. Our lens could be out of focus to the humanity of others. Think about the way that you or people in your community talk about immigrants. Are they talking about immigrants and undocumented citizens as humans, as people who are refugees in many cases, trying to find the best life for them and their families? You know, politics aside, we can still talk about these people as if they are the humans that they are, with the respect that they deserve, and thinking that you would do the same thing if you were in the position of trying to take care of yourself and your family and your opportunities and potential. Is your lens the one of empathy and kindness? And so the strategy here is to think about how we can evaluate the state of our lens, the way that we look at the world, and make a plan to adjust it accordingly. So there is a worksheet here, and I want to draw your attention to it, and we're going to go to our promised break. And so I'm going to do a time check to see how we're going to space out the next 90 minutes. So I'm not sure if we're going to go to groups with this yet, but you can still pull this up on your packet. And so I want you to think about if mentalizing is that process, considering if it's the process of considering a person's unique perspective and motives, how can our lens affect our assessment of others? Think about how your lens, again, we're using a metaphor here, how your lens could be clouded by a narrow or not yet expanded worldview. Is our lens out of focus to the humanity of others? Is our lens one of empathy and kindness? And think about how can you make a plan to continue evaluating your way of looking at the world, way of looking at others, and begin to make adjustments to that. So with that, we're going to take our next break. We're going to come back at 3 o'clock. Again, this is in your packet. You can find it on, it's activity 4. So that's going to be on page 10. So you'll have that there. Again, the key terms and the questions for your reflection. All right, I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome back. So moving on to the next portion of the brain, we're going to talk about the temporal lobe. So stereotypes reflect conceptual associations between social groups and a particular set of attributes. These associations are thought to reside in our semantic memory. Social information represented in the anterior temporal lobe is selected into the medial prefrontal cortex to support the process of social cognition. Thus, the knowledge of social stereotypes appears to reside in the anterior temporal lobe. Next, we're going to talk about the inferior frontal gyrus. This is where stereotype activation takes place. So stereotype retrieval and implementation happens in the left inferior frontal gyrus and response inhibition on the right IFG. So stereotypes are both activated and applied. With intentional effort, aka self-regulation, we can inhibit the influence of stereotypes on behavior because, again, stereotypes are activated and applied, and that's where self-regulation really comes into play there. In just a minute, we're going to watch a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of the Single Story. And the takeaway that is from her talk is she says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so one of the things we must do is to read, to watch, and to learn, do anything that can help us challenge stereotypes. On my website, I've got a variety of resources that you can access. A recommended reading list. I have books by people from different perspectives than what are mine, and so it's helpful to read different novels to understand stories as well. I also have some topical teaching videos on this webpage, some of my favorite videos that I like to show when I'm teaching, some recorded webinars, as well as some recommended TED Talks. Anyways, it's a wealth of information. I try to keep it updated. I welcome your recommendations for things to add as well. And again, the shortcut for this is engineerinclusion.com/read, engineerinclusion.com/read, and so you can visit that webpage. There is a space in the worksheets where you can make a list of things, the topics that you want to study, resources that you want to access. And so again, that's activity 5 in the worksheets. The next strategy here is that by listening, learning, we can actively challenge stereotypes. It takes an intentional effort to do that. And so we're going to watch the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of the Single Story. You can access some reflection questions in your packet on this as well.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tylan, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukuloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them, I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in a Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds, films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce? What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
This TED Talk for so many reasons, because I think it provides us with a shared vocabulary to think differently about some of the stereotypes that we run into. I think it also relates well to the 5 words I shared earlier. What else might be true? It invites us to think about what are the different reasons why something might be happening? What are other stories that we can tell about people? You know, I often think about this a lot from my perspective doing engineering education work. You know, growing up, there were certainly lots of engineers in my, you know, people within engineering that I knew, but they were all look like my dad, white guys, and I didn't see any examples of women who were doing that work. So it became a single story to me. And so these single stories can be limiting not only to our potential careers and our trajectories, but they can be single stories in so many different aspects of what we see in ourselves as far as our potential, but they can also become limiting things in how we relate to others. Because again, these single stories are simply stereotypes that we apply and generalize to entire groups of people. So there's space in your activity workbook to reflect deeply on this, but I want to give you a chance to share out to the whole group. What are some things that come to mind to you when listening to this TED Talk? Like what resonates with you? What questions do you have?
One of the things that stood out to me, and it's not really super insightful, but it was interesting when she talked about going to college in a different country. We have a lot of students. I can't imagine going to college outside of our country and just what, you know, how they might look at our world and how we might look at them and the questions that they may encounter and things like that. So that's one of the, you know, it's a small thing, but, you know, we work at a college, so we do have, you know, students that are not from, you know, the United States. So it's interesting just to kind of hear the thought process that she encountered. And I don't think that they were intentionally malicious. You know, I see a lot of that where people don't mean to be rude when they ask you these things. It's just an implicit bias.
But what we can do is to help them recognize that there are single stories, that we can't generalize entire groups of people, and that in order to build relationships and to help people feel like they aren't on the margins and that they are included, that it takes work on our part, those of us from the dominant group, to study and to ask questions and to really challenge in those stereotypes and dispel those myths.
Another thing, Megan, something that I noticed is that sometimes people are afraid to ask those questions. So I am from a minority population, and there have been several times that I've had people from the dominant society or population work for me or report to me. Either way, I always try and make sure that they feel absolutely comfortable asking me things. You know, I don't want to create this tension to where they can't even say a Black student, you know, or anything like that, because I understand that there are these differences and we come from a different world. So one of the things that I try to always be mindful of, and even if I notice that they may have a question that they want to ask, but they're not sure, I try and make sure that I'm very welcoming about, you know, asking questions. And I also do that so that I can ask those same questions.
There's another quote from Chimamanda Adichie that I love. She says, if you don't understand, ask questions. If you're uncomfortable about asking questions, say you're uncomfortable about asking questions and then ask anyway. It's easy to tell when a question is coming from a good place. Then listen some more. Sometimes people just want to feel heard. Here's the possibilities of friendship and connection and understanding. And that's a quote from her book, Americana, which is a novel. But I think that question, I love that question because it just says ask and listen. But what that doesn't say is it doesn't say ask a person to speak for their entire people group, right? Don't ask a woman to speak for all women in engineering. Don't ask a Black person to speak for the experiences of all Black people, because one, that is, they can't. And two, it becomes really overwhelming when you continue to get those kinds of questions. So ask questions, but again, ask what is your experience. Don't say, please speak for your entire people group. Yeah.
I did make an interesting discovery that's not really related in a huge way, but it is nonetheless. When I finished college, I moved to Chicago. and I had been in the South and in Louisiana and Texas for many, many years. And I had worked up there, but when I moved there, it became apparent to me that I was in a whole new world. And it was interesting too to me that people assumed that I could not speak English. And so they would say to me, "But your English is so good," as if I should be speaking with some sort of horrible English because I was from Louisiana. And it was really funny to me because I would turn that around and I'd say, "Oh, that's really interesting. And you're not rude at all." You know? So I think sometimes and these are silly stereotypes that aren't really hurtful, but at the same time, they demonstrate that we all have stereotypes. And once the conversation is brought up, I mean, that was their way of asking a question. How could you possibly have such good English? Where were you educated? Or, all sorts of things can come from that. And my saying, "Oh, well, you're not rude at all," means that I could have held the stereotype that I assumed that you were rude, but I didn't. And that's it. We just need to break down the wall somehow and then start a conversation. It's different cultures are going to be different. There are going to be those differences, and the best way is to open up the communication and start talking about it and ask. Same thing with disabilities. I think people are so afraid to call attention to a disability when you don't have to be mean about it. You just say, "Can I help you? What are your limits that you need help with or don't need help with?" And those kinds of things. It's that open communication that makes people more comfortable, I think. If you ignore something or if you feel uncomfortable with it, then that is going to translate to them.
Yeah. Bionica, it looks like you were going to respond.
I was just going to ask, just what are some things that we can do to help people feel more comfortable asking questions about certain things? And Ray, I have a similar story. I'm from Texas. I moved to Georgia and I taught school there. And my students thought that, we rode horses. They didn't think that, they were like, "You guys have a mall?" And I was like, "Dude, I'm from Dallas." Our city is bigger than this, but they didn't understand that. They just didn't know. But how do you like, what's a standardized way? I know it's like takes a cultural shift and change, and I know we're doing some things here on campus, but what's a way to invite those questions or a standardized way to ask? As you see, I'm very I talk fast, so I'll just ask, and I'll just say, "I don't mean to be rude," or whatever. But how does a person that may not be as open with communication ask those questions?
Yeah, I think that there's no right answer to that because not everybody is in a space to want to talk about their experiences. Not everyone's in a space to be ready to talk about their experiences. I think that, Ray, what you're saying, and I think Bionica, what you're adding is like there's a difference between intent and like the impact of those messages. So for someone who is from a dominant group, being told your English is good may not hit you as hard as someone who is from a marginalized population, like a Hispanic person or a person of color who is told that every single day. And it's a question of their intelligence, right? And it's an unconscious question of their intelligence, but that can affect people. It's that accumulation of those messages that becomes much more impactful to them. I have on many occasions taught side by side my Black colleagues, and we're both equally talented at our work, but yet people will come up to them at the end and say, "Well, you're so articulate." They don't say that to me, right? And there's a deep embedded implicit bias and message in that comment. And it's that they didn't expect someone who looked like them to be able to speak in the way that they did so that they could understand. And so our part of our self-regulation of recognizing where the stereotypes and biases happen in our brain is being really cognizant of the way that they can manifest in our interaction. Even if we intend the best, there could be a negative accumulation to that person of asking one more time something that is challenging to them. And so Bionica, what you're asking around how do we create dialogue, so much of that is around the culture of your team, the culture of your classrooms, the culture of your organization, of facilitating opportunities for people to share their stories. But what must happen in those kinds of instances is people have to be ready to listen. If you invite conversation for people to have roundtables, if I tell you my experience and someone across the table says, that doesn't happen, I don't believe that. Like that, clearly you took that wrong. You've just dismissed my experience. I told you my truth and my story, and we might giggle and say that doesn't happen. It happens all the time. And this is particularly important when we're talking again about marginalized groups. When people share their experiences, people will have a tendency from the dominant groups to get defensive and say, oh, that's not what I meant. Okay, that isn't what you meant. But it doesn't mean that you didn't just do this thing that affected me. So how we respond when someone says something like that to you, like, oh, did you realize that this is what that meant? You can say, wow, thank you for that feedback. I wasn't aware of how my language could be construed in that. And I'm sorry, right? Like, I'm going to work on my language and work on the ways in which I communicate and check on my biases and check my prejudices and check my discrimination. And so how we can be open to that is to be listeners, right? I've been teaching a course on listening to another client group in Illinois, and it's for like how to coach for educational equity. And the number one thing we have to be able to do is to listen. And what's interesting is we never learned like the skill of listening, right? And so, Bianca, I think I'm talking in circles to your question. But if you're asking like, how do I get people to, instead of making assumptions, ask me about my experiences, sometimes that person isn't ready to ask those questions, right? Because they've not learned how to ask questions about race. It doesn't mean they don't need to get ready and to study and to ask those questions, or they're not ready to ask you questions about what it's like to be this person in this environment. But I think as long as we are authentic, transparent people who are open to those kinds of conversations, based on what you've described of yourself and how you're open to your people having conversations with you, then you'll build a reputation for that. Of like, Bianca is a safe person that I can go ask this kind of question and be heard in that. Sorry, I don't have a checklist like here's how to create deep conversation around tough issues. But I think that when we start to learn these things and we learn the nuances of how they happen in our brains and our communities, we can begin to start to facilitate some of those conversations around these things. And I put out like a weekly newsletter. They always have strategies in them. And so those are great things that you can take and say, let's have a conversation about this with your colleagues. And so sometimes it takes having something to start that conversation, to initiate opportunity to talk about things that people may be uncomfortable talking about.
I think you answered it perfectly, just being transparent and honest. Yes, you answered it, absolutely.
Good, okay, thanks. All right, we've got just 12 minutes. I want to wrap up our session today. I'm happy to answer any more questions, but I want to make sure we finish up what I promised today. So the last part of the brain that we're going to look at is the anterior cingulate cortex. So the ACC has been widely implicated in the monitoring and detection of response conflict. So what that means is that our cognitive control is needed to curb the personally unwanted influence of implicit stereotypes and prejudices on our behavior. So in 2 fMRI studies in which subjects completed implicit association tests measuring racial attitudes, false feedback to the subjects indicating that they showed racial prejudice elicited heightened anterior cingulate cortex activity. And this degree of activity was associated with feelings of guilt, which is a self-regulatory emotion that promotes pro-social behaviors. So let me kind of tease that apart again. So they put some people in an fMRI. So there were 2 studies that did this, and people completed an implicit association test, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in just a second. And the tests were measuring their racial attitudes. So people were provided false feedback, irregardless of what their responses actually were, and said that you show racial prejudice. It triggered that part in their brain that they could see it from the fMRI. And so what that associated with was that it was associated with feelings of guilt. And that helps us create those pro-social behaviors to want to change our behavior and do something differently. So the takeaway here is that the control of implicit bias requires the detection of a conflict between a bias tendency and one's goal to act without bias. So you can take the implicit association test to help you identify your unconscious biases. Awareness is the first step to action. So in your packet activity, I think it's 7, it's the very last page. We're not going to do this together. This is a homework exercise, is take an implicit association test. And then there is a separate packet that is linked from the packet, a second PDF. Let's see. So here, there's a PDF that I want you to read. So on making sense of your implicit association test results. So you're going to go here to take some tests, and then to help you debrief that on your own is to read this. And so what that document does, this is from the Ohio State Kirwan Institute. It says, you know, common reactions is like, I don't believe it. It's just not true. Or I accept it, or I'm uncomfortable by it. I feel distressed. So these are some common reactions, and this document will help you process what it is that you're feeling. This is a really critical tool as well. If you're choosing to do this with some of your colleagues or with your family, this is a great debrief tool to help you to process that information. Okay. So in wrapping up here, the key takeaway from this workshop is to remember that there are networks in our brain that support the self-regulation of cognitive control, which can help us reduce the expression of prejudice and stereotypes. The given was you have a brain, you have prejudice, and you have stereotypes. The takeaway is that you can use the networks in your brain to support your cognitive control and reduce those expressions. So a summary of the strategies, again, these are summarized in your packet on the 3rd page, is first to know your brain, which is what we're doing today. You've examined the different parts of your brain to understand the way that it works. The second is to examine your fear conditioning. You've got a worksheet to help you continue to work through this. I gave you a formula that allows you to think about, when I see this, I feel this, I know it's a fear conditioning because, and I can do Y as a response, as a self-regulation strategy. We talked about how we can practice empathy to drive connection. Empathy is absolutely a practice. I love that, to use this term on this, because it's not like you have it or you don't. You get to choose in every conversation, am I going to practice empathy, or am I going to practice sympathy, which drives disconnection? The 4th takeaway is to stop dehumanizing others. Pay attention to your language. Pay attention to when you are saying things that dehumanize other people. If that means you're calling them an animal, it means if you're calling them a clown, if you're calling them something that is not, a human identifier, if you're calling people who are, different groups of people, if you tend to use generalized stereotypes and language that makes them lose their humanity, this is the problem. The next is to change your lens. So we talked a little bit about this and thinking about what's the way that we look at the world, the literal sort of lens that we perceive things. And we're going to spend more time on this in the next couple of workshops. I shared with you my recommended read and watch list. So, I will keep that updated. You can always visit it and see what I add. I need to, again, update that pretty soon. The 7th thing is to actively challenge stereotypes. If you hear a stereotype, say, hey, that might be a stereotype. I don't think that's a complete story of those groups of people, or what insert any kind of descriptor of who's being described. We have to challenge them. And then the last one on this list is that we have to identify our implicit biases and begin to address those. Now, I have one more. And the last strategy is that silence is complicity. By not saying anything, by not standing up for those who are marginalized and oppressed, we become complicit in their oppression. And I feel pretty certain no one wants to choose to be complicit in the oppression of other people. So our action is to do something, to say something, to increase our awareness, to use our self-regulation strategies to make meaningful change that not only affects our interpersonal connections with others, but affects the systems that which we contribute and support on a daily basis. So what you're taking away from this workshop, so we've reviewed some of the barriers to an inclusive and just world. You have 15 key terms to either add to or reinforce your vocabulary. We examined 8 neural mechanisms in our brains that support prejudice and stereotypes, which are the underlying functions of bias. And you're taking away 9 self-regulation strategies to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. So before you close, I want to get us to do a quick reflection and application. We're going to write down 3 things that you learned today, 2 things that you'll do differently, and 1 immediate action item. And so before we'll go, we're going to close out. Everybody's going to share at least one thing from this list that they create, one list of the 6 things. And then I'll have some final words. And I'm going to drop the evaluation link in the chat as well. All right. So gather those reflections. We're going to go around the proverbial room here and share at least one thing from your list. One quick response. Allison, what's one thing from your list?
Well, I really liked what you taught us about empathy, about a good response for that when you don't have the words. I'm an introvert, so I'm usually just sort of silent. I don't know what to say. So I love, I'm thankful you felt comfortable enough to tell me. I don't have any words, but I'm listening. Those
That's
kinds
great.
of statements.
Thanks, Allison. Bionica, what's one thing from your list?
The fear conditioning. I had never thought about how our brain actually has these. I love the Pavlov's analogy and just how our brains are conditioned to respond to certain things in certain ways.
Great.
That makes it make more sense to me.
Thanks, Bionica. Ray Scott, one thing from your list.
Well, practical thing is I discovered you have a really good list of books and resources that are available. I kind of came in toward the end of the session today and was limited to what I actually heard, but I think I developed an overall sense of the value of the benefits of the doubt is that it's better to err in social situations and educational situations, listen more and judge less.
Yeah, so true. Thank you. And I will I'll tidy this up into a rewatchable session if you do want to rewatch it. Rebecca, what's your one thing from your list of 6?
To be more mindful about how I look at people to begin with. Just be more mindful to begin with. Just try to think positive about everything unless there's something negative to actually have a response to.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Awareness is the first step, and then we can begin to use a self-regulation to choose different behaviors. Thank you so much. All right, so again, I dropped in the chat an evaluation. It's just a quick evaluation. If you want to evaluate the session today, I do provide that feedback back to the BPCC staff. So I welcome your feedback. I took your feedback from last time and changed how I did this session and created the packet. So I'm taking your feedback and doing something with it. So I welcome that feedback so that I can make these better learning experiences for you. So in conclusion, as we wrap up today, our goal was to unravel the bias in our brain to create a more inclusive and just world. So when we learn about bias in the brain, we can better connect to our heart. When we connect our heart, we can change our behavior to be more kind, empathetic, and inclusive. When our heart and our brain work together to combat prejudice, stereotypes, and bias, we can dismantle systems of oppression, and together we can create a more just world. I'm so grateful for your time today. I'm looking forward to meeting with you again next month. And if you have any questions, I'm here for you to answer those questions. Thank you all. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Megan.